Rosen, president of the Peterson Institute, and we have many distinguished colleagues. Two-part session for you today on high-growth emerging economies. In the first session, we'll be doing the Washington rollout with our partners from McKinsey Global Institute. They're solely responsible for publication, but we love working with them on discussion and promotion. McKinsey Global Institute's Outperformers, high-growth emerging economies and the companies that propel them. Those lucky of you who are with us in person get the glossy color printed copies, and all of you watching online or at a later date will be able to download the full report. It's a very exciting report, and we have one of the lead authors, Anu Madgavkar from McKinsey Global Institute, and I'll say a word about her more in our discussions in a moment. We also then have a very brief lunch break and go right into an exciting speech. We are delighted to welcome back our friend, our rock star, Arvind Subramanian, who will be giving his first public speech here in Washington since leaving the Indian government on the broad issues of growth in emerging markets, in emerging economies, and including a very interesting comment that's basically gone viral with Dev Patel and Justin Sandefur on everything you know about cross-country convergence is now wrong. Both of these topics, we are not an institute that does development issues per se, but long-term comparisons of growth, cross-national trends, what leads to success, the interactions with the international markets, both as openness to trade and flows of finance, the costs and benefits thereof. These are all matters with which we have been deeply concerned and will remain concerned for an ongoing basis. And I want to give my thanks to Arvind, but also to Anu and McKinsey Global Institute for coming together and giving us the intellectual backbone for such a discussion. We particularly are grateful to be focusing on these the success stories and the possibility of success in an environment where there's been a lot of chatter about emerging market crises, and not to downplay that in any sense, but there has been a lot going on even as the U.S. has turned its back or been absent in various ways over the last 10 to 20 years, and it is important to recognize and be aware of those developments. So our first panel will begin with a presentation by Anu Madgavkar. She is a partner with the McKinsey Global Institute. Since joining McKinsey Global Institute in 2011, she leads teams based in India working on global as well as India-focused research. She's looked at global labor market skills, gender economics, another place where we do work, migration, poverty alleviation. She's authored several reports and white papers on India's economic growth and has co-authored, again, today's report, Outperformers, High Growth Emerging Economies. We have three very distinguished discussants, and all friends or affiliates and friends of the Institute. Dr. Nancy Birdsall, of course, will lead off. She is President Emeritus and Senior Fellow at the Center for Global Development. I think we can still call it our sister or brother think tank. She was its founding president for the first 15 years from 2001 to 2016. I'm not going to go through all the areas in which she has written. She was a director of the Economic Reform Project at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, author, co-author, editor of more than a dozen books, of course, served in various international financial institutions and leadership roles, and we're delighted to have her with us today. Speaking second after Anu will be Professor Cullen Hendrix, who is a non-resident senior fellow here at the Peterson Institute, has done extensive work on conflict, political economy, on natural resources. He's director of the C. Chiao Kang Center for International Security and Diplomacy at the Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. He's done consulting work for a number of U.S. agencies, a much broader range than we usually see: Department of Defense, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the Political Instability Task Force, and the World Food Program. So we're delighted to have Cullen with us. And then finally, the always brilliant and exciting Simon Johnson, professor at MIT, Ronald A. Kurtz Professor of Entrepreneurship at MIT Sloan School, and also a senior fellow at the Institute for the last decade. Currently, some of you saw him in his new engagements working on digital currency issues including the Digital Currency Initiative at MIT's Media Lab. We had an event with him a few weeks ago. He is one of the co-authors of this year's Geneva report on cyber currencies, and it was a wonderful event. We're delighted to have him back on stage so soon. But first, let me call on Anu to give us a beautiful McKinsey slick presentation of the cons of making us all jealous of outperformers and high growth emerging economies.
Thank you, Adam. And many thanks to the Peterson Institute for this collaboration, which we at the McKinsey Global Institute also really value and look forward to. I hope you find the content of the presentation as enthralling as the slick graphics, but we will keep that question in abeyance till after. So, emerging economies, over 40% of global GDP, they've, as a group, driven over 60% of global growth over the last few decades. It seemed like a fascinating and very important question to really look at what drives growth or what has driven growth across these economies. So as we looked at the landscape, we set a very simple sort of lens to this question, which said that over long, sustained periods of time, which of these economies has really achieved high per capita GDP growth over, say, a 50-year time frame? And then we found out that there were just 18 that had done this. Not all of them did it over a 50-year time frame. Just 7 have achieved very rapid growth over a 50-year time frame, and then another 11 actually did it over the last 2 decades or 20 years. The first set is a set of, I think, well-understood and well-known names. We looked at countries that had achieved more than 3.5% real per capita GDP growth, setting this threshold because it's enough to bump up a country from low income or lower middle income status to roughly upper middle income status. So with that sort of a goal, these 7 countries, China, of course, and then a bunch of countries in East and Southeast Asia, are the well-understood economies that have actually achieved this. The other 11 are less recognized, less discussed quite commonly, but over the last 20 years, we found that these 11 had achieved more than 5% real per capita GDP growth. This includes India from the South Asian contingent, a few others from Southeast Asia, including Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, a set of the Central Asian economies, and then Ethiopia, actually, which was the only African economy that made this threshold. Very diverse in terms of drivers of growth, diverse in terms of per capita income levels, of course, diverse in terms of form of government, role of government, types of companies, and so on. But interesting nevertheless, and we then sort of peeled the onion on what actually drove growth across this set of economies relative to others. Now, how did the others fare? We had about 40 economies that we call the middlers, or middling performers, and they didn't convincingly raise their income rates at levels that would narrow the gap between them and the rest of the rich world. So they grew at between 1 and 3.5% per year. Within them, they're not all the same. There are some that have accelerated recently, that include Bangladesh, for example, quite notably. There are some that have consistently grown at this pace, and then there are some that have been fundamentally more volatile. And then we had a small set, I think about a dozen or so, economies that were structurally or systematically underperformed over the 50-year period, growing at less than 1% per year in terms of per capita GDP. So this was the landscape, and then we really looked at the so-called outperformers and what actually made them grow. On a relative basis, their growth has, of course, enabled them to increase real per capita income to between 8 to 10 times for most of the recent outperformers, 40 times for China, which is in a league of its own, and then the rest have pretty much tracked or slightly under-tracked the high-income countries. So if we look at what sort of the decomposition of this growth, what drivers there are. At one level, this is obvious. There is a so-called virtuous cycle. It's a mutually reinforcing cycle of various elements of growth. And what this really tells us is that growth can't be sustained over long periods unless the elements of productivity translate into reasonably broad-based income growth, which then helps economies actually support demand and support further improvements in productivity. The bulk of the productivity growth in the outperformers actually came from high savings and investments, a culture of thrift, but also a set of institutions on the financial side that actually either mandated, forced, or just encouraged high levels of domestic savings for many of the economies. And then the ability to actually invest that back, either in the form of public infrastructure or in the form of private firms. Total factor productivity added another good chunk. And then what was notable is that on an average, to a lesser or greater extent, many of these economies actually achieved wage growth and household income growth of 4 to 5 percentage points higher than the middler economies. So there was some notion of sharing of the productivity gains with the broader set of workers and households, as well as firms that actually were active in these economies. And on the demand side, there was not only some growth in annual consumption, which for the larger economies was sizable, not less so for smaller economies, but also this notion of tapping into global demand, which is again well understood, but 30% of global goods trade, 25% of global services trade was actually driven out of this set of 18, rising from low single-digit shares about 20 years ago. Two sets of institutions, if you will, have played a role. And again, I would say to a lesser or greater extent, there are variations amongst these countries. The two sets are government institutions on the one hand, and then private firms on the other. What did governments do? Now, governments actually in these countries, as I mentioned, vary a lot in terms of political form or the means by which they are in power and the things that they do. But there were some common themes, particularly amongst the long-term outperformers. On the one hand, we did see in many of these countries the notion of setting a national and a sectoral vision or an agenda for economic growth, either for the country or for certain sectors, and to do that in a way that engaged private firms that would ultimately be the vehicles of driving that growth. What was interesting is that many of these governments offered incentives and concessions in the form of either exchange, foreign currency or licenses or concessional rates of interest. But in some cases, these were accompanied by ways to stimulate or promote or almost require increasing levels of competitiveness and productivity. And they were conditional upon companies actually doing that. Where this was so, it worked. There have been other cases where there has been concessional elements on offer where competitiveness was not really required, and that worked a lot less well. But this was certainly one interesting feature. And then on the other hand, there was an attempt across many of these governments to boost their own agility and capability of the bureaucracy, the ability to try small experiments, whether in a special economic zone or in a certain state or province, and then generalize that to a broader set of principles that were adopted across the country. So this was on the government side. On the firm side, this is, I think, a less well understood aspect of development. Simply the fact that firms are important. You can't really grow economies if you don't have firms. Sounds really simple. In many parts of the world, that equation is not fully appreciated. So we looked at a set of 27,000 firms around both the high-income countries as well as the emerging markets. We set a threshold of $500 million and above in terms of revenues. So that's how we defined large firms. We found that SMEs did play an important role, but it was really the large firms whose performance was quite differentiated in the outperformers. We can see here that in the outperformers, this set of large firms actually grew very rapidly in terms of revenue share to GDP, for example, almost tripling. Their direct contribution to GDP also more than doubled. And this was far more stark or evident in the outperformers as compared to the rest of the emerging markets. And what was also interesting is that the story was less about a small set of very large companies that were secure and protected in their space. We looked at, how do these companies stack up in terms of leadership, looking at economic profit generation as the indicator for corporate leadership. And we said, what share of these companies were top quartile players in terms of economic profit 10 or 15 years ago, and what share actually remained there versus being displaced by other attackers who came up, either new companies or who came up from lower levels of leadership. And we found that in the outperformers, the share that stayed in the top quartile of leadership was actually somewhat lower than in the high-income countries. To different extents, you see India is actually not doing so well on this dimension. Some of the others are. What this suggests is that it's a combination of maybe the push to be more competitive, as well as policy changes and other forms of volatility in the environment that actually creates churn and dynamism in the corporate sectors of many of these countries. And therefore, it's not always the case that these companies are incumbents that are safe and well protected where they are. They actually have to withstand a lot more, a combination of disruptive behavior on the policy side or on the competition side, and have been actually dislodged quite actively. We also ran a survey. Now, surveys are what they are. They represent, I think, more your innate sense of optimism or your own self-image necessarily, rather than facts. But the insights are actually quite interesting. We ran a survey across some 2,000 managers of companies in the outperformers, in other emerging markets, and then in the high-income countries. And we found across a lot of dimensions that we tested, the orientation to introduce new products, the keenness to actually adapt your strategy to reflect, or even in many cases, drive technological disruption, the desire to actually look overseas, and then just the ability, both the appetite and the ability to invest in a very nimble and quick fashion. Across many of these dimensions, managers in the outperformers sort of consistently felt that they were ahead of those in other countries. And we see examples, right, of companies that have actually displayed such behavior on the ground. Just a couple of examples. In India, for example, if you look at the investment appetite and the nimbleness to invest, we're talking really about a telecom player that comes in, invests 4 times the level of anybody else, and then within a year or year and a half, actually rises to number 2 or number 3 in the market. So there is a certain aggression there. Here's another example, again, reasonably well understood, I guess, but China's mobile handset manufacturer who looks at Africa, goes out, builds a position of leadership there on the back of R&D that is actually designing handsets to suit the African market, in this case, multiple SIM cards. R&D centers in Africa and back in China, and the ability to innovate products to actually meet new market demand. Now, going forward, there are a lot of uncertainties and complexities that these outperformers will face, like other emerging markets. Trade is certainly one of them. What we thought was interesting is just this historical trend, which might be something that plays out even more going forward and creates new opportunities for other emerging markets. And this is really the fact that if you look at South-South trade or China-South trade, which is trade essentially amongst emerging markets as opposed to between them and the advanced economies, this share has actually risen very rapidly. Part of that is probably consumption-driven, because China's role in driving global consumption has actually been very high. Part of that is value chains coming out of China and getting embedded in some of the other countries. So there is intermediate goods flow as well. But certainly a trend that is an opportunity could also mean that whatever happens to China trade actually gets transmitted to other economies through some of these flows even more intensively going forward. Automation is the other big future trend. Again, we see that, particularly companies see that in the emerging markets as a big opportunity to drive up productivity. There is a 15 to 20% potential displacement and redeployment of work, which is, I think, an issue that governments in the emerging countries are particularly cognizant of. But the lower income countries, and we looked at a set that included actually some of the African ones, like Uganda, Ethiopia, Rwanda, India, Vietnam, Bangladesh, all of these would still have per capita incomes low enough to suggest that manufacturing jobs increase is still not a closed door or a closed window for many of them. That's something that they could look at in addition to driving up productivity gains in manufacturing. If this were possible across the entire landscape of 50-odd non-outperformers, there is obviously a big potential GDP increase that could happen in the world. We estimate that at $11 trillion, that's like sort of adding another China to the world economy. The probability of doing that is, of course, a question mark. But while we don't predict, what we did do is to look at more recent history of the last 3 to 5 years. And the quartiles that you see on this chart are actually countries based on fundamental improvements that they have already demonstrated in the last 5 years on things like savings, investments, infrastructure growth, company performance, and many of the other indicators which drove the success of the outperformers. So based on this, and then looking at more recent growth trends, there are a set that would include Bangladesh, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, Rwanda, Bolivia, and so on, that could actually be promising, that could break out and join the ranks of outperformers going forward if they're able to sustain this more recent growth momentum. So on that somewhat promising note, I hope I'm going to end there and look forward to comments and reactions and questions. Thank you.
Which one works? Both? Okay. Great treat to be back at the Peterson Institute. In some ways, it is a healthy reminder that CGD is, well, I used to think of CGD as the little sister of the big brother, but lately I've been working on the ecosystem for women's empowerment, and I think it's time to think of us as a twin. An atomist. And it's very difficult to go after a very nice presentation by Anu. And before, I don't know Cullen, but I know Simon and Arvind, and I'm sure they'll be exciting. So I thought I'd make a few remarks from the point of view of a development economist. And let me start with what I like about this report, having tried to skim through it. It's a very long, detailed, carefully done report for those of you who haven't seen it. One thing is it definitely takes the long view. And as Adam said in his introductory remarks, that's kind of nice today when everybody is worrying about Argentina, Turkey, now Pakistan as well. As a growth person, a development person, it is all about the long run. Second, I like the large company approach. It's certainly a different entry point for understanding why some countries have been successful and more successful than others in the long run. And the contestation point is quite important. I didn't pick it up in the report, but many of you will have noticed that the US and the UK among OECD countries are the weakest on that in the chart that Anu put up. And the report is very clear that, and she was too, that contestation differentiates these successful emerging markets from the OECD countries. And that's important because we're all worrying now in the US economy about what it means to have these very large companies where there is more rent sharing with labor, but that generates across labor different levels of shared sharing and income growth. Third point that I like, it's doggedly optimistic about future growth. Really, no region or country is left out in terms of what could happen. And it's even more doggedly optimistic about future increases in manufacturing growth and employment, and in high productivity services growth and employment. So what's the big but for me? And the big but is why? What is it about these high-performing economies which have high-performing companies and large companies that is making a critical difference? So when I started looking at the report and saw the 7 top performers, I could not, all of which are in East and Southeast Asia, I could not help thinking about a report I worked on at the World Bank in 1992. I was trying to calculate how many years ago is that. It's quite a long time ago. And the nickname of the report was East Asia, the Miracle Economies. So I thought about what that report said. It said, A, exports. The export orientation is important because it keeps economies, it forces them to be globally competitive. And that helps on all the macro fundamentals, exchange rates, et cetera, et cetera. Second, it didn't come out well enough, I think, in the 1992 report, but effective government, government that somehow works. There was some emphasis, it was very quiet and gentle on things like forced savings and other things that some people might call industrial policy. And some of the greater push toward understanding how industrial policy worked back in 1992 was very much resisted inside the World Bank. And for an interesting bit of history, Larry Summers had left at that point to go work on the Clinton campaign. And Larry was actually quite interested in making some, digging in a little bit more into what at the time was seen as very worrying industrial policy approach. But, you know, these are effective governments that for some reason work. And that brings us back, of course, to, among other things, Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson, but I'll come back to that in a minute. So, and very high savings and investment, which Anu mentioned, which is an outcome in part of effective government. And of course, the sharing of growth, so it's a virtuous cycle that happens. So what would I add? You know, there are other things. I think very important, flexible labor markets, not the trap that Latin America fell into about highly dual labor markets. The push for growth, which Rwanda and Ethiopia, the only 2 countries in Africa that are mentioned, share. The push for growth at the very top. In East Asia, it was because of the fear of China, the big boy, you know, around the corner. And it resulted, among other things, in very high levels of investment in people and in people's goods. Hong Kong had housing, Korea, and the other tigers, a lot of spending on education. And this was in effect to co-opt the peasants and workers so that the communists wouldn't convince them to change government. I mentioned forced savings. I think the initial very equal distribution of wealth and income, including land, made a difference in the evolution of things. And I'm glad to see Anu shaking her head, because that contributed, among other things, to the politics around sharing the gains. So one thing that I said that I liked about the report is the optimism about all the regions. If I think about Latin America, there's the obvious why not Latin America? I mean, it's really stunning that Latin America is left off. No country in Latin America makes it into the list of the 18 top performers. So what is the problem? I do think, Anu mentioned it, sharing the fruits of growth. But the report is not, it comes to inequality at the very end. And that would be, for me, something that we should all think about more. The problem of income inequality in Latin America, which goes back to dependence on natural resources, the colonial era, poor institutions. I mentioned Simon Johnson's work. And now we look at today at Brazil, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute, where the politics looks really terrible. What is going on? Some people might say, well, it feels a little bit like the US. But it's very disappointing because Brazil, for all its troubles in the last 20 years, has had a rich fabric of state governments, municipal governments, parties. It has political problems, but it's very worrying to see this rise of populism and nationalism. So I'll come back to that in a minute. Africa, other than Ethiopia and Rwanda, I just find it hard not to be concerned about what's happening in Africa. Besides dependence on natural resources and on commodity prices, my colleagues at the center, Alan Gelb, Vij Ramachandran, have emphasized the very high cost of labor in Africa, which goes back to the fact that agriculture is so relatively unproductive, so you don't have, the high reserve wages that lead to better, higher urban wages. And even in Ethiopia, case studies suggest that where in the export zone factories have been created, wage workers are really, there's a lot of turnover, they're very unhappy, they don't stay. So it's very tough with high cost of labor to be competitive and to compete, say, with Bangladesh and Cambodia and so on in even pajamas, right? It's just tough. And of course, there's a political element in Africa too, which in a different paper of Vij Ramachandran, she raises, which is African-owned firms have much more trouble raising capital and finance than internationally owned firms in Africa. And this seems to be associated with the lack of contestation with the politicians, with the top leadership. They don't want local rivals acquiring power. So it goes back to tough politics in a poor setting. And of course, the other problem in Africa is it's just all these tiny markets that are not connected. And the striking lack of investment, because of low savings and investment, striking lack of investment in public infrastructure. So it's hard for me to see my way through the factors that seem to be associated with the top performers, to see my way through those somehow happening in many of these small economies in Africa. Will Rwanda be able to carry on? It's such a tiny economy, or is this the outcome of a big push at the top from a president who's committed to growth? And when he's gone, I don't know what will happen. Will it become not just a 20-year apparent success, but a 50-year success? You have to be a lot more optimistic about India than about Rwanda and even Ethiopia. So let me make a final point about this issue of income inequality and go back to the Brazil situation, among others, and maybe Indonesia, which is another worry. Anu made the point about the logic of demand to generate continuing growth. And that logic is grounded in sharing the benefits of prior growth. And then we have the issue, always the issue of income inequality. But I think something that is critical that isn't said enough is the following. We have a situation in many developing countries now where the middle class has grown, almost 1 billion people added to the middle class in the last 25 years. There's a second group, there's a group under the middle class. I see Homie here. He has probably thought about this more. Those who are living on $4 to $10 a day per capita. And I like to call them the strugglers. Some people call them the strivers. Some people call them the lower middle class, which I think is confusing because they are not middle class. If you define middle class as materially secure in pay stub jobs, it's, in a country like Indonesia, a very small number. It's getting up to 50% in Latin America and many countries, but in Indonesia, even in India, still really small. So in a country like Indonesia, where, by the way, the Gini coefficient has risen, and in China it's risen to 0.5, but it's also risen a lot in Indonesia in the last 10 of this period of success. You have a group of people that are really concentrated in informal services. They're in the service economy, they don't have regular income. They have benefited enormously from high growth over the last 15 or 20 years. They have expectations that will be frustrated in those countries that don't get onto this high-performing track. And that's what we're seeing now in not just Brazil, which I've mentioned, in Indonesia, in Central Europe, and so on. So let me stop there and say, great report, but I kind of missed, maybe I'm too used to reading World Bank and IMF reports. Why? Why? What is behind the success of these countries that would provide lessons, maybe more nuanced lessons for the underperformers? Thanks.
Wait, I'm looking. How should I advance the slides? Ah. Good afternoon, or excuse me, good morning. It's still the morning time. We'll be having the afternoon session when Arvind is giving his comments a little bit later. Thank you for inviting me to be here today. I'd like to congratulate Anu and her team on an excellent and incredibly thoughtful and thorough report, which I'll talk about at some detail a little bit later. I'm sort of the lone political scientist at the Peterson Institute, and I thank you, Adam, for accepting me despite that fact. I'm going to focus my comments on the relationship between governance and growth. So I'm going to hopefully try and interrogate some of the issues that Nancy put on the table. That is, I'll be focusing on the role that political and economic institutions play, or don't play as the case may be, in accounting for these outperforming economies. I'm going to focus my comments actually on the recent outperformers, and in particular the recent outperformers save India, for 3 reasons. First, I think the tale of China and the Asian tigers and Malaysia and Thailand is now one that's relatively familiar, if not still relatively complicated. Second, I suspect we'll be getting a decent dose of discussion of India during the keynote. Maybe, maybe not. If not, I apologize for not covering it in more detail. And then third, I would like to focus on the recent outperformers for a simple yet I think lightly discussed reason, or lightly discussed anyway in the report. Their performance actually challenges a lot of what political economists knew, or at least we thought we knew, about the institutional prerequisites for sustained growth. All right, so what did we in fact know? With some violence that's going to be done here to more complex stories, I think I would boil it down to different views being ascendant in different decades. In the 1980s, right, we had endogenous growth theory, which placed emphasis on education and the concomitant accumulation of both human and physical capital and the positive effects all three would have on total factor productivity. Okay, that's good. In the 1990s, we had a discussion that was dominated by trade and financial liberalization and integration. Here, the emphasis was placed primarily on reforming debt-racked economies via relatively rapid market liberalization and government austerity measures. There's a ton more to be said here. Obviously, there's a ton that's been said about that in these halls. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move on. In the 2000s, right, we had this emerging consensus that the emerging consensus was that institutions, in fact, ruled. If you get the economic and legal institutions that govern exchange, property rights, dispute resolution, and corruption right, good policies and growth would follow. This consensus was embodied in the 2002 World Development Report entitled Building Institutions for Markets, and also in a 2004 Journal of Economic Growth article entitled, quite directly, Institutions Rule, written by my esteemed co-panelist Arvind here, as well as Danny Roderick and Francisco Trebi. The financial crisis, the epicenter of which was in the very set of economies thought to have gotten those institutions most right, I might add, as well as the rise of China, have really challenged this perspective. So that in the 2010s, what do we have? What have the teens given us in terms of an orthodoxy here? Well, they may not have given us an orthodoxy yet, in fact. It may have given us a much more wide and varied set of perspectives on the causes and fundamental institutional causes or political causes of long-run growth, or what period of what my colleague at DU, Eileen Grable, refers to as a period of productive incoherence in economic governance. From the resurgence of quasi-mercantilist state capitalism to the Beijing Consensus to arguments about the importance of democratic political institutions for growth, we're working with a pretty mixed bag at this point of explanations and prescriptions. And what's interesting is that these various perspectives forwarded in the teens so far have all tended to focus on the macro-political economy. That is, the political institutional environment in which policies are made rather than specific policy levers themselves. All right, so let's look at those institutions. How are they doing? And how are the recent performers kind of stacking up? I hope that that's legible. So let's focus on rule of law for a moment, because rule of law was very central to the narrative that people like Simon and Arvind were working around in the early 2000s. You know, the extent to which agents have confidence in and abide by rules of society, in particular contract enforcement, property rights, the police, and the courts. It's central to a lot of that discourse. So here we have the World Bank development indicators. It says government effectiveness. I apologize. This is actually rule of law. Although if you look at government effectiveness, you get a very, very kind of similar story. This is normalized in terms of percentile. So obviously the median is equal to the mean here, 0.5 or 50th percentile. When you remove India from this group, what you see is that most of these countries, on average, are hovering in the lowest quartile. In fact, the lowest quintile in many of the years. There seems to be some improvement according to this metric that starts in 2009. But I wonder whether or not that's due to actual improvement in rule of law, or it may be the way that sustained growth is creating a little bit of a halo effect. The vast majority of the governance indicators that inform these kind of indicators, like the World Bank governance indicators, are based on expert survey responses. And survey respondents may at this point be hardwired to look at this kind of pattern of sustained growth and say, well, they must be getting something right with respect to governance or rule of law. So parsing kind of the causality in this circumstance might be a difficult thing to do. Okay, so if it's not rule of law, what about democracy? So in 2014, Daron Acemoglu and colleagues released an MBER paper called Democracy Does Cause Growth, which demonstrated a causal effect of democracy on economic growth operating through a variety of channels, ranging from greater investment in education and public health to also forestalling some of the grievances that are associated with kind of investment scaring political instability. All right. Well, the political regimes that we're looking at here that are in power in the recent performers and have been so for the last 20 years or so are a strikingly undemocratic group, say of India, right? Measuring a concept like electoral democracy is hard, but the state of the art is the measure I'm presenting here, which comes from the Varieties of Democracy Consortium. I can talk more about that later if people are interested in construction. It normalizes democracy on a scale of 1, so your Swedens and Norways of the world, to 0, North Korea, Eritrea. You probably get the picture. And once we exclude India, as I mentioned earlier, we're left with a decidedly undemocratic set of regimes. As the world has gotten slightly more democratic over time, the recent outperformers have actually become even less democratic during that time period. So you might argue that I'm kind of, not really comparing apples to apples here, which is what the report actually very carefully does in terms of pairing the recent outperformers with a more, I guess I would say, institutionally comparable set of comparator cases. But these data are kind of hard to ignore in the aggregate, and I think that they suggest a very difficult to avoid conclusion. And that is with respect, at least to the recent outperformers, institutions, at least in terms of rule of law, government effectiveness, and democracy, don't seem to be telling us much of the story. Well, or do they? So, as Anu mentioned, these recent outperformers are a heterogeneous group with respect to governance institutions. But I would actually say that there may be underlying that sort of surface level heterogeneity some interesting similarities that actually point back to some of the earlier discourse on developmental states and the Asian tigers. And so I'd like to move in that direction for the remainder of my comments. Of the recent outperformers, they're predominantly communist or post-communist regimes. We have 5 former Soviet republics, 2 communist regimes, 3 one-party or former one-party, and in the case of Myanmar, kind of a military government in transition types of regimes. That is, this list is not dominated by the types of personalist dictatorships or monarchies found, say, in the Middle East and North Africa or in sub-Saharan Africa, some of the regions around which there's fairly significant concern about future developmental trajectories. So that is, this list is dominated by the types of authoritarian regimes that are the most highly institutionalized in the sense of being established or routinized and bureaucratized in practices and customs, forms of authoritarian government that are out there. Many of these are, in fact, if you sort of look at the life history of these regimes, are reminiscent of, albeit a lot less familiar than, the pro-growth developmental authoritarian states associated with East Asia in the 1970s and 1980s. All right, so if it's not these institutions defined as the rule of law and democracy that are accounting for success here, what is? And how can we link it to kind of political institutions? Well, my conjecture is essentially as follows, and I'm going to close with this. Communist regimes and one-party developmental states are different from many other types of non-democratic regimes in one very important respect. Their governments and their bureaucracies were designed with the specific intent of reshaping the economy, either around central planning or centrally planned economies, or export-oriented models such as the Asian tigers. Now, this may not have always produced the best policy outcomes, but it did, in most instances, endow them with relatively educated cadres of bureaucrats and comparatively strong systems of education and public health. The data in the report seem to support this kind of interpretation, with Central Asia and Southeast Asia performing relatively well in education expenditures and health expenditures. And directly relevant for our discussion today, it typically also meant closer and more coordinated business-government relationships with industrial policy, capital channeling, and the pursuit and the intentional attempt to develop these kind of national champions, these globally competitive large firms that we've been discussing so far. So I will end, actually, roughly speaking, where I began. The recent outperformers are a fascinating bunch of cases, in part because they challenge a lot of what we knew or what we thought we knew about the institutional prerequisites for growth. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much. My name is Simon Johnson. I'm at MIT Sloan School of Management and at the Peterson Institute. And thanks for the opportunity, Adam and Anu, to be here today and to discuss this really very interesting report that I promise I plan to use in my classroom starting from next week. I think what I really like about the report is 2 things. First of all, as other speakers have said, that you've taken the longer-term view. Growth goes up, growth goes down, even decade by decade. So let's step back to some beginning data and sort of see who's been able to put together a sustained performance. Absolutely the right way to think about this. And also your linkage, which is commendable, and we should see much more of this from all of us in academia and in business, linking the macro environment with what firms do and what we want firms to do and what we should be encouraging our students, for example, or all the McKinsey consultants who go out and set up businesses and go work for business groups. What's the message, both in terms of what works for the private sector and what has a positive social impact, like more growth for more people? Fantastic, absolutely. So let me make 3 suggestions or divide my comments into 3 parts, all intended to be constructive and really to stand on the shoulders of your report. The first is about institutions, the second is about trade, and the third is about technology. Now, as Nancy and Cullen have already mentioned, that there is this substantial literature that you reference and you also build on, saying that institutions have had a very substantial impact on growth and income per capita, and this effect has actually been surprisingly long-lived. In fact, you could actually turn the entire report around if one wanted to be somewhat more negative and say, my goodness, how few countries have even managed to perform at the US level over the past 20, 30, 50 or longer period of time. But when I go look at the data, actually, I wouldn't start in 1960 necessarily. 1960 is driven entirely by the availability of some popular data sources. I would go back to 1940 to assess the modern period, the beginning of the modern world, the change in the balance of power, the collapse of empires, the rise of the United States, the beginning of the US-Soviet confrontation. And when I go back and look at those data, some which I have in my bag, there are striking stories of convergence. But it expands the set of countries in an interesting way. Actually, some of the ones that really stand out are European countries, including some of the countries that weren't at the heart of West European prosperity in the 1920s, 1930s, before 1940. You also see Japan, for example, stand out in that. So institutions matter. They've had these long-lasting effects. Let's hope at some point, this is to Arvind's, I hope everyone got a copy of Arvind's nice article that was circulating on the table outside, and hopefully it'll be available to everyone watching online. Arvind making the point the last 2 decades may well be different. I hope so, Arvind. I hope that everyone can escape this institutional legacy, but it's been something of a drag on growth to date. And the report is also very good on, make your governance better. You don't have to become a democracy if you feel that strongly about it, maybe. But how about improving the effectiveness of government? How about the ease of doing business? How about making it easier for the private sector to invest, not just for a few people who are, let's say, tight with the people in power, but spreading that more broadly? Completely sensible, and I'm sure we can find a World Bank report from the 1960s or 50s, Nancy, that nailed it. I'm confident of that. You guys have always had the right message. We're just repackaging what the World Bank has previously discovered. So that's terrific. But in addition, it comes out of your report, and I would say it comes out of looking at this pattern of data from, say, 1940, or even, let's go back before 1914. What is the strategy? What are the economic policy levers that you can pull, or strategic direction you can have for your economy that makes a difference? Trade. It's openness. What did the Europeans do before 1914? They traded. They traded to a remarkably open extent. This is, the stories and the legends of the gold standard, maybe a little exaggerated, but they were trading among themselves, and they were reducing trade barriers. The basis of German unification, for example. And the story goes on. So the strategy of this East Asian miracle is not, and obviously these countries learn from Japan, and obviously they were plugged into the American security network, and obviously the arrival of container ships had a significant impact. I get all that. But the strategy of trade has been with us for a very long time, and it is a strategy, exactly as you articulate, that can get people together thinking about growth, thinking about improving the quality of products that you offer. It can be a way in which you can provide sensible government support without getting captured, potentially. And that's obviously a key piece. Which leads me to the third and most interesting, and I think forward-looking part of what we all have to grapple with, which is about technology and technology today. Well, actually, again, let me go back to 1940. When did technology change? When did we enter this modern period? We're all obviously very caught up in digital devices and so on. But the technology, I would argue, the basis of creation of technology and deployment of technology changed actually in and around 1941 in this town, when the United States government decided to put a massive amount of resources behind the development of science and technology. The US was not the leader in world science prior to the 1940s. That was Germany, that was France, that was the UK. The US, for example, won hardly any Nobel Prizes. I thank you. So for the record, Adam said, and let me just repeat it so everyone has it on the microphone, that the US switched, the US dollars were made more effective, just as Adam said, by allowing an influx of refugees. They should have allowed more people to come in, actually, Adam, while we're on that point. And those refugees brought with them a lot of the talent, a lot of the ideas that have been developed in other places, including Germany. This had a very big effect on World War II. And after some hesitation, it became an important part of the US strategy subsequently. So the big technology, why did the US grow so fast, is another way to turn this question around, after World War II. In part, it was because you had a public-private partnership where the public sector was underwriting the development of, let's call it basic science, and some commercialization of technology, and the private sector was riding that really well. I don't know if you know of any technological miracle or marvel or major new invention of that post-war era that didn't have this public component in it, let me know. I've looked, I can't find one. The only significant buyer, just as one anecdote, only significant buyer of transistors, microchips, in the early, even mid-1960s in the United States, the basis of all the prosperity and all the legends of Silicon Valley was not just the US military, it was the Minuteman missile program. Right? So that's the basis, that's the foundation, but it's a public-private partnership. It's not the public sector by itself. Now, onto the technology and onto the point about firms. Why haven't we seen more convergence? Now, Arvind says we're converging more than previously. Fine. Let's hope he's right. Let's hope that's sustained. But why not more? We have an open flow of people. We should, I think, to Adam's point, allow more people to come into the United States, particularly more people to study. They spread ideas. They go home. My students want to go work in their countries and other countries around the world for McKinsey, I'm sure, initially, all of them. But after that, they want to go out and set up companies and help large companies do well. Why haven't we had more of this convergence? What is it about? And let's say you don't even have to develop the technology. Let other people spend the big public money, or that's dwindled, but they'll spend the public money, and then you can be the fast followers. Why don't you get more growth from that? What are the obstacles to that, either at the country level? Why do so many countries struggle with that? Or even in the countries that we like and countries that are picking up on this. India would be a spectacular example. I hope Arvind can deal with this a little bit later this morning. Why don't we see more of this impact? I think some of the really interesting insights, and I know there's a lot more behind here, and hopefully this will come out in other work you do through your institute, along the lines of how contestable do we want it to be, these firms? I actually think more contestable is better. I think that's the people, and Nancy alluded to this, the people we worry about as having sort of, dropped anchor and having big monopoly rents and not being contestable. Okay, there are some technology companies in that category now, but previously it was a non-technology story. Technology, and I would still argue, there is a lot of creation, there is a lot of entrepreneurship. That's all good. I think we like the contestable pieces, Anu, and I think that's an encouraging and something that you should be, if you agree, talking to governments about, talking to the private sector about. And the question is how to get more of that and how to spread more of that through the economy, and particularly lift some of these, as you flagged, the barriers to the growth of the small firms not becoming not being able to become larger firms. That sometimes they're regulatory barriers, sometimes they're more overtly political barriers. But I think that's a key piece for all of us to focus on it and to think about spreading this. The technology may, of course, be part of Arvind, the puzzle Arvind's setting us today. Greater availability of information since the 1990s, easier access to information through the internet in particular. Maybe that is a major encouragement. But I also would tell everyone or suggest that everyone look at the part of the report that deals with automation and also potentially premature deindustrialization. I'm not sure I'm completely convinced of the latter, but certainly automation is intensifying. Now, what does that do to this strategy of trade and growth through labor-intensive exports as a way to climb a ladder, for want of a better metaphor? I think it puts some pressure on many of these countries and maybe makes it more difficult. Now, hopefully there are smart people, my former students, your employees, who will figure this out and who will figure out how to reposition these firms to take advantage of the changing opportunities in the global economy. Hopefully the US is not going to close down and disrupt that global economy. I think that's a major threat and a major worry we should all be speaking about. And I think the Peterson Institute does a terrific job, but it's surprising. I wish that there were more people in the business community talking about the importance of that kind of growth through openness, not just for the rest of the world, but also for the United States and also in terms of sustaining technology-based prosperity in the United States. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Cullen. Thank you, Nancy, and especially thank you, Anu. If I could ask you all to come up here and we'll have an open discussion with our audience, all four of you. Allow me, while our distinguished panelists make it up there, to make a couple bridges from remarks they made to work we've been doing here at the Peterson Institute. Nancy rightly pointed out whatever happened to Latin America, or what never happened to Latin America. In a volume forthcoming, Chairman Zettelmeyer and I edited on the productivity slowdown, there's a very interesting essay by our non-resident fellow, Jose de Gregorio, on the failure of even his own Chile and many other people doing all the right things in Latin America, not leaping ahead, and that's available as a working paper on the website, PIIE.com. I also want to mention, picking up on the focus of Anu's remarks, two other aspects that were picked up as well by some of our commentators. The idea of the export champions and the large firms leaping ahead is, of course, something that a lot of academics have worked on and has myriad implications. Our colleague Carolyn Freund, now on leave at the World Bank, did some excellent empirical work on this in emerging markets in her book for us a couple years ago, but also our colleague Jason Furman, Arvind's colleague at the Kennedy School, and Peter Orzag have done work on the issues of the large firms and contestability in the US and the tech markets, and obviously McKinsey and McKinsey Global Institute have worked on this. This is a very lively area of research, and it just underlines how Anu and her colleagues' MGI report fits into this broader set of discussions. The final thing I would mention is, just as an advertisement and invitation to all of you and those of you online, on October 31st, Chang-Yong Ri, director of the Asia Pacific Department at the IMF, will be presenting a thematic version of the Regional Economic Outlook for Asia Pacific here at the Peterson Institute. It's going to be focusing on some issues that he, Jeremy Cohen-Seton, Thomas Hebling, and myself brought together in our conference on productivity growth and dealing with the slowdown in Asia. And it gets to many of these same issues. So we'll have another perspective on this running theme. So we hope you continue to engage with us. But first of all, I would like Anu to take however much time she wishes if she'd like to reply to any of the comments made by her discussants.
Thanks, Adam. Well, I guess first, thank you very much for the constructive feedback and critique and pointing out, additional areas that we can look at. I think we really benefit from discussions of this kind. I don't fundamentally disagree with anything anybody said. So I think these are some questions we ourselves have grappled with in the course of the research, and perhaps constrained by our own ambit or area of expertise, which is not, for example, political institutions, perhaps constrained by the way we scoped the research. To Simon's point, I think it's fascinating to look back even further in time and look at similar stories of convergence with perhaps similar themes, as he pointed out, going back to the 40s or the 20s. And these are certainly avenues we should look at going forward. But I think that a few things that really stood out for me from the comments made. I think the first was the notion of what sort of institution and what sort of political system, or is there an answer to that? Very much framed around Nancy's question, why, which is, I think, is it the absence of certain kinds of institutions that actually come in the way for many countries? I think it was very clear, as Cullen pointed out, that it wasn't necessarily a form of government that enabled one or the other set of countries to do well. For every example you have around the sort of orderly governments that are designed to promote economic development, including in the communist or single-party regimes, you also have fundamentally less predictable governments, for example, in India, right? So you have all forms within this set, and it's therefore not clear that one is necessarily better or essential. But what we did feel by looking at many indicators, again from the World Bank, that looked at the effectiveness of economic policy, the predictability of that economic policy, or confidence that investors or companies or observers or these experts, right, who are surveyed in the building up of such indicators, just the confidence that they had about the predictability or the efficacy of these policies. on many such indicators, what was clearly more important was a general sense of improvement, not that the outperformers were fundamentally better on many of these indicators than other countries or high-income countries. They actually, many of them started out and ended out actually worse. But on some of these indicators, there was positive momentum. So I think what perhaps those who invest are looking for is signs of that positive trajectory. And why it doesn't happen more often, I think, is really the important question. Nancy talked about putting growth at the center somehow. And I think that's again, strikingly important in the lessons from the set that we looked at. The notion that in the political or the social contract between those who govern and those who are governed, the notion that economic progress and a betterment of your material life, even in the face, I would argue, of rising inequality, because based on other work that we've done, which is actually focused much more on the US and Europe, we do find that there are two sets of expectations that workers or households have. One is a sense of fairness or equality, and the other is actually just a sense of sheer positive movement. The idea that the future will be better for me, the future will be better for my children. So that appears to be a very strong component of what's actually enabled some countries to put this notion of growth and material progress, even in the face of inequality, out there as part of the agenda. And again, why it has not happened, we can only hope, I think, that it actually happens in more regimes and in more countries around the world. I agree with Simon's points around automation. I think just the additional perspective there is that automation has many different types of impact on work. So there is clearly the labor substitution impact, but there is also a lot about embracing automation to enable companies to actually target and access market opportunities much faster. A simple example is in the apparel or the textile industry. Automation is coming in not so much to substitute workers, but to enable producers to shorten turnaround times, be more flexible, because buyers ultimately are responding to very rapidly changing consumer demand and expectations. And they want their suppliers to be equally nimble. And a lot of that is coming through things like predictive analytics or digitizing your supply chain. So those aspects of automation are almost a must-have and might actually have not as much impact on workforces through direct labor substitution. So I think sector by sector, value chain by value chain, there will be components of automation, and it's almost a must-do for companies to actually embrace that in the context of emerging markets, and then hopefully new opportunities to be found for people impacted.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Anu. We have a great audience here today. I'd like to open this up for questions. Our usual ground rule, please identify yourself when asking a question. Please make it seem like a question, not a speech. And you may either raise your hand at the front tables and Jessica will bring you the mic, or you can go to the standing mic in back. Side note, this is an incentive for those of you sitting in back to move up and fill in the tables, because then you get the fancier mic. That gentleman there, please.
Hi, I'm Jack Goldstone from George Mason University, also a political scientist, kibitzing here. Thank you for the presentation. I would remind us that USA GDP growth per capita since 1969 is under 2%, so it's a low bar. So very few countries have done well. Economists have not been able to lift up countries beyond that. As Arvind pointed out in his paper, this seems to have changed since 2000. Since 2000, there's much better performance across the board. But this does coincide with the rise of China as a major world player. And the emphasis on what are the causes seems to me to overlook the interdependence. A case I know well, Hong Kong, where I lived for a couple of years. Hong Kong flourished greatly after 2000, and that's often attributed to its rule of law, openness, other great institutions. But it also depended on the next door growth of China, who had completely different institutions. And one could argue, although China accomplished much, it would not have been able to attract so much foreign direct investment if it could not channel that through the legal institutions in Hong Kong. So simply saying China has bad institutions, Hong Kong good, but nonetheless they both grow, sort of misses the point. So my question, I am coming to a question, Adam, is it was crucial for the performance of many developing countries that China became a huge consumer of raw materials, a huge producer of exports, a huge consumer and generator of services. For the next 20 years going forward, we can't count on China to do that. China will have to deleverage while dealing with...
Question mark.
Yes. Question mark, do we need another China? Do we need another billion people to grow 10% a year in order for other developing countries to continue to outperform developed ones?
Anybody, starting with Anu, anybody wish to comment?
I'm not sure we must have some other billion people. We would love to have that, right? We would love to have, India riding up, Indonesia continuing to do so, large parts of Africa doing so. But I think the notion of writing off China and saying China's not going to play a role over the next 20 years, I think that's just misplaced. I think they will have to adapt, and they are in the process of thinking about how to sort of adapt their strategy to be more, focused on consumption going forward. And that itself is an interesting transition that will create new kinds of opportunities for the rest of the emerging markets, certainly, as it rebalances, hopefully towards higher productivity and definitely towards higher domestic consumption as well. So I think it's going to change, but I think the notion that we should write off China for the next 20 years and hope there is another China, that would be misplaced in my view.
Go ahead, Nancy.
Thinking about Latin America, yes, China's investments, but more its purchases of commodities from Latin America over the last 10 or 15 years has been critical. The problem is perhaps that it's not necessarily, so I would say, no, we don't need another China. That is not, for many countries in the developing world, necessarily consistent with what you need to do to achieve long-run growth. Indeed, the evidence from Latin America suggests that the increase in prices of commodities and exports of commodities during the boom undermined incentives for investment in human capital, in higher skills, because the benefits went, among other things, to those strugglers. So the commodity boom of the last 15, 20 years has been good for a group of people in the short run. I don't know if it's created the right set of incentives for long-run growth. So we don't need another China.
Thank you. Cullen?
I agree with a lot of what's been said so far. This question actually raises an interesting question, so I would like to ask just a brief intra-panel question. Were there countries that looked like they would have been recent performers absent the massive contraction in their major export markets during the financial crisis or the global financial crisis? Because the picture might look very different if there were 2 or 3 countries, maybe from Africa, maybe from Latin America, that would have made the grade, say, for a collapse in demand in their major export markets. That's just an empirical question.
Yeah. Unless anyone has a quick empirical response, I'll turn to the audience who would like to go ahead? Jeremy.
Jeremy Zettelmeyer, Peterson Institute. So I guess this is directed mainly at Cullen and Nancy, but also the others. So like Cullen, I was really struck by the fact that in your group of recent outperformers, you have these Central Asian dictatorships, right? Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, so highly corrupt, post-Stalinist regimes. And so, if we're going to make a story why these countries are doing well, and if we think they will continue to do well, I do really think it challenges our views on what drives development. And I don't find them so easy to amend or to rescue than what you said, Cullen. Because it particularly challenges the notion or the story that we have seen of why Latin America hasn't been doing so well, right? Because these are highly commodity dependent, highly unequal countries. And what really differentiates them from Latin America, I would say, is that they haven't even made the attempt at redistribution, which we call populism in Latin America. So then the message seems to be, it's okay to be a corrupt dictatorship as long as you do some investment in education and you keep the ship going, the repressive ship, and you don't even try populist experiments that would lead to redistribution. And that would be a pretty dark message. So I wanted the panel to react to that.
Yes, Simon, please.
It's just a point of information. Maybe it's a question. I think it's a point. You started in 1996 for that sample, the recent performers. Well, as I recall, there was a very big disruption that those economies experienced with a GDP decline on the order of 20 to 40%, right, German? Immediately prior to that. So that's not to take away everything from their experience, but the nature of that precipitous decline does suggest you get some sort of rebound and some sort of redeployment, which I think would play into the little bit of a statistical artifact that you have there.
Yep. Cullen or Nancy on the political point.
Sure. I mean, that's a very challenging kind of question. I mean, I think that, I guess what I would say is if I were going into a situation like this, actually, before I answer, many of you were around for these kind of discussions. How many of you had all of your money in on the Central Asian economies in 1996 for being the best growth performers of the next 2 decades? Show of hands. Right. So if I'm going to go into a situation like this that you describe where you have these kind of regimes that are reasonably kleptocratic and corrupt, I would rather do that armed with a bureaucracy and many technical agencies that were still largely staffed by kind of middle-aged people who've been brought up under the Soviet education system than not having that. And so I think the question about sustainability is, in part, is that something that can be reproduced moving forward? I mean, I think this, if I'm betting on it, my simple answer would be to say probably not. And so maybe that is kind of a one-time fortunate legacy of the Soviet past there that may be driving that. That's just a guess, though.
Nancy, is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, the question made me realize that it's worth invoking Frank Fukuyama's point about order and the role of the military in the long sweep of history in generating a kind of organized approach to anything. So in addition, you have the point of it's the rebound with some entry of a more market-oriented systems that we notice, particularly in Eastern Europe. It seems to have been somewhat maybe delayed or at lower rates of rebound, but apparently extended. I was equally puzzled by Belarus, and Uzbekistan. So it's a combination, as always, of the natural resource push and so on. But I think there is something to Colin's point about one party, and it has to do with if you read Fukuyama, you start to see that the short run may be rather long run for some economies. If you think of back to Rwanda and Ethiopia, they're notably the most repressive and best organized governments in Africa.
Just a clarification on the statistical aberration point. One of the filters that we also used was a year-on-year growth filter, right? That said it shouldn't be just an end-to-end growth that gets affected by a structural challenge in the early years, but also that in at least 3/4 of the time periods under consideration, these countries should have actually met the bars. So I think it's really interesting that fundamentally resource-dependent economies in Central Asia, unlike other resource-dependent economies which are languishing in the underperformer bracket, right, actually managed to beat this threshold for at least 75% of the years in a 20-year period. It suggests that there's something else going on in terms of the ability of these governments to maintain their implicit social contracts or whatever they are, and get the job done in terms of at least tapping the resources they have, with some efforts possibly to ease business climate, as we know have taken place in some of these countries.
I'll just remind people that even before Francis Fukuyama, going back to political science, Sam Huntington's Political Order in Changing Societies, looking at South Korea and the single-party state, which had some uncomfortable recommendations and assessments from democracy point of view as well. Sorry, so this gentleman over here, and then John. So please, Martin.
I'm Martin Bailey with Brookings. I also work with MGI, and I've worked with Anu, although not on this particular report. Congratulations! I thought it was a terrific piece of work, and I enjoyed the discussion. In the productivity studies that we did in the 1990s at MGI, the lessons that came out, and some of them I think are reflected in comments that have been made, but particularly the role of competition, and that industries needed to compete against global best practice industries if they are to become productive themselves. And some of that obviously can be done by trade, so it reinforces the notion that competing in exports is helpful to improving productivity in your domestic economy. But also, if you look at domestic industries, where regulation becomes more important, and it's the type of regulation. It's not that all regulation is bad, but if you have regulation, as many countries do, that restrict competition, that sort of foster corruption as opposed to competition, that may, in some cases, as it was true, I think, in India at one time, actually intervene directly in how production is done. So regulation that says how many machines you have to have, or how many workers you have to have for each machine, and stuff like that. Those things were very counterproductive. And on technology, I guess we've tended to find that domestic technology development wasn't so important. If you want a best practice steel industry, Germany will sell you the best practice steel industry. You don't have to develop it yourself. That's not true, obviously. You can't become an Apple or that way, but for the broad sweep of the economy, that technology is usually available. So my question is, did you find those same things, would you say those same things applied to the growth that in the more recent years that you found, or would you say that those have been in some sense refuted by what you found?
I think it's more the former. That is, these were common themes even in the more recent period that we looked at. I think the idea of openness as a means, not just to tap into demand, but as a means to bring a higher level of productivity, know-how, technology into companies that operate in these emerging markets was certainly a strong theme. I think some people found it surprising that FDI per se was not a big, in quantitative terms, a big driver of the investments that took place in most of these outperformers, that it was actually domestic savings, I think fairly evident to those who've studied it, but a lot of people didn't really understand that. But the notion of FDI actually being a driver of some of the productivity improvements, which then got either replicated or innovated through process improvements and process innovations, not necessarily fundamental new technologies, but applying these in different ways to actually scale them perhaps to large sizes of markets, that, as we've seen in China and in India, for example. I think these were, again, common themes.
Thank you. Please, Simon.
One thing I liked in the report, and just want to make sure it doesn't get lost, is you also had emphasis there on the development of, let's say, indigenous innovation, so innovation, particularly in the digital space, that is appropriate to particular let's say, lower income environments, so more use of mobile phones, for example, or different kinds of services. And I think this is a little bit new, Martin. Now, it's not necessarily the entire economy, but we meet a lot of entrepreneurs who are highly experienced, very globally plugged in, watching carefully what's happening in all markets around the world, both at the same income level and at different income levels. And I think that's encouraging, and I think that fits very much with your story. Why don't we see more of it, which is still a question, a pretty fair question, but it is happening, right? I know, and it's happening more and more.
I think it is happening, and I think I want to go back to the point you made about what is the role of governments in actually making investments or spending money on fundamental new technology, and is that something that we've seen in these countries? I think we've seen it much more in public-private partnership form, but nevertheless, I think the role of governments in catalyzing, particularly with mobile internet and digital disruptions, catalyzing either by making strategic investments in building platforms. So for example, in India, the building of 1 billion digital IDs, on the back of that, a stack of services linked to those IDs, the ability to make person-to-person payments more seamlessly than anywhere in the world, at lower cost than anywhere in the world, didn't take a lot of money, frankly. It's not sort of capital-intensive stuff, nor was it fundamentally new technology, which is breakthrough in nature, but the ability to take technologies and scale them and have government policy as a catalytic lever there to make that happen, forcing then a set of behaviors in firms that want to participate on that. I think that's a really interesting way in which this whole role of government in technology is changing in the current world compared to the role that might have been played earlier.
Okay, thank you. John, the last question.
Yeah, John Lipsky, Johns Hopkins SAIS. I have a small observation leading to a small question. Small observation, if you look at thinking of Cullen's presentation of the various decade fads by decade, thinking of, well, who would qualify, what country would have qualified for having performed well, but using all those criteria, improving institutions, openness, increased trade openness, improvement in rule of law, liberalization, deregulation. That sounds like Chile. And my guess, so then I was wondering, well, why didn't Chile make the grade? And I realized, well, I suspect if you had started your sample, your long-term sample in 1985, not 1965, Chile would have been up there. So leading to a small question, how sensitive, did you look at the sensitivity of who your winners were according to the time frame you chose?
I think every time window or time frame may have thrown up a few names here or there which were different. But that said, I think the bulk of the answer would still be the same. But you're absolutely right. So there were borderline stories. There was actually Mozambique as well in Africa for some reason that was close to the threshold but didn't quite make it. There was rebound story. Yeah. And Chile was certainly one of them as well, yes.
Thank you. I'm going to declare a brief recess. For all our in-person guests, you're invited to grab lunch. Those of you sitting at the back are invited to fill in the seats at the table so you don't spill your lunch. We will reconvene in 15 minutes at 12:30 for our keynote speech by Arvind Subramanian. But first, let me say a big thank you to our experts. In particular, congratulations to Anu Madgavkar, please forgive me, Anu Madgavkar, and her co-authors from McKinsey Global Institute on a fascinating report, Outperformers, High Growth Emerging Markets. Thank you. Now, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. I'm Adam Posen, president of the Peterson Institute. And for those of you turning into the second part of our two-part session on high growth emerging economies jointly with McKinsey Global Institute, welcome. We have had a terrific panel on the new McKinsey Global Institute report on overperformers, on high-performing emerging markets, with discussion by Simon Johnson, Nancy Birdsall, and Cullen Hendrix. But now I am, of course, thrilled to go to our keynote speech by Dr. Arvind Subramanian, titled, I hadn't seen the title before this morning, Late Converger Steam or Stall. Before I turn the floor over to Arvind, let me say a few words about him. Obviously, we are thrilled that Arvind has chosen to come back to the Peterson Institute as part of his post-government service life. He is currently a non-resident senior fellow here and a visiting lecturer in public policy at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. This followed 4 years, nearly 4 years of service as Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India starting in October 2014. It's important to recognize just how much and how wonderfully Arvind accomplished in that job. There are many countries have chief economic advisors. Very few of them get a rock star following based on substance. And Arvind uniquely did that. He not only energized the untold thousands reporting to him in what used to be the Economic Planning Agency, but he created and rethought the economic report of the Council of Economic Advisors in a way that excited literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions of readers in India and around the world. And it wasn't just his popularity, it was also his substance. I would keep hearing from officials I knew in the US government and the Japanese government and the British government and the German government. I was at this meeting on such and such, and Arvind was there. Arvind, it was like Kilroy was there. Arvind was everywhere. Joking and flattery aside, two of the most incredible accomplishments taken place during his time in the first Modi term included the reconciliation of value-added taxes across the Indian states, an enormous leap forward in economic integration and efficiency for India, and the continued improvement of digital access and distribution of government benefits in a way that had been long foretold but not yet fully realized. I could go on. I just say, for all of us who know Arvind, it is just a personal and intellectual pleasure to have him back out of Indian government, because even he only has 24 hours in a day. And when he was in Indian government, we didn't have all the benefit of his constant idea spark plugs and comments and engagement. And now we're getting used to having that back. But most importantly, whether in India or the world, Arvind is a public intellectual. This was seen in the brief blog he and colleagues did challenging the perceived wisdom on convergence or lack thereof. And we turn to Arvind for his new and latest thoughts on growth in emerging markets. Thank you, Arvind.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be back. I think the next best thing to not being Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India is to be at the Friday lunches at the Peterson Institute of International Economics. I have to say that, Adam's generosity and good spirit tend to get ahead of his of the objective facts. So you should discount all that he said by a factor of 2 or 3 or 4. But Adam, thank you so much for the kind introduction. It's wonderful to be back to thinking about not one particular country, but about growth and development much more broadly. And so today's talk is going to be on called the late converger. And I want to talk about it in slightly analytical terms with the late convergers as a category, and then think about how they've done, what their future is, but all in light of the excellent report that McKinsey and Anu presented today. I have to always, I like to say that, whenever I speak about growth, I think the words of Robert Solow always echo, all discussions of growth begin with great rigor and end in a blaze of amateur sociology. And I think that, we saw a little bit of that today, but it's not a lot of good political science and theorizing, which I thought was very interesting. But like the others, let me join the others in saying that I too found the report very interesting, very thoughtful, lots of new things. The point especially that several people made to connect the country with the firm. I think that's terribly important. I just want to make a couple of observations, again, in terms of thinking about these things going forward. One, I did find, I think, a few missing countries who I would think of as kind of major successes, and also it kind of balances the kind of Asia focus that we have. One, I think John mentioned, I think Chile is certainly one of them. I think it depends on when you start the clock, of course. I would say in the Caribbean, I think Barbados is another. I don't think we should overlook small economies by any means. I think they have a lot to offer by way of lessons. And I think the most glaring omission for me was the two major successes in sub-Saharan Africa, Mauritius and Botswana. I think they are offer very valuable lessons, because in one case, and this is a lovely paper that Daron Simon wrote on Botswana, how it overcame the resource curse. I think it's a valuable lesson there, because I think it is a pathology that still affects lots of countries around the world. And Mauritius is one of my favorite countries, because even though it seems to be way out in the ocean somewhere, it does have, or had, a lot of the potential pathologies of conflict, resources, and so on, and overcame that. And just as a factoid, I want to throw out there, because Cullen is here, many political scientists are there, I would say the only two successes in sub-Saharan Africa are the continuous democracies. They started democracies, are still democracies, so the only two countries that have succeeded in Africa are, and I think that's interesting. There may be something out there, but it's certainly worth exploring. So I think that that's one. The second comment I would make is that I think that the firm perspective is very useful, also because it has this very important policy recommendation which you made of contestation at the top. But I think there are two sides to that, and I think one of them was not emphasized enough, that when you talk about the success of big firms, I think two things are important for contestation. I think the small should be allowed to become big, and the big, some of them should die. So the problems of exit and impediments to the growth of small firms, I think, are both very important policy issues. In India, for example, I think the penalty to becoming big is actually quite huge in terms of all the labor laws and so on. So I think we shouldn't overlook that. Underlying that, of course, is that a slightly more controversial point that, there's a religion around small and medium enterprises all around the world. And I think we have to be careful of that, because, small firms, if they remain small, they are low productivity, they don't employ very much people. And as Adam said, Caroline's work on the export superstars as well, it's all a story of small becoming big, and some of the big, dying. So exit, so not just competition, but exit at the top, and the ability to become big, the dynamism, I think are two very important, policy recommendations that perhaps... So with that as background, let me go into my talk here, or this is the other way around. So I'm going to, just have three broad topics: good news from the past, convergence, And then, of course, I'm going to behave saying why the optimism can be sustained going forward. But I think I'm probably now today more on the side of having anxieties. And so I'm going to dwell a little bit more on why this convergence process can stall. So the steam versus stalling is going to be the tension that I'm going to highlight today. So first, the good news, and as several of you have noted, and this is, by the way, just I have to, one prefatory remark. I feel embarrassed when people, attribute the institution's rule to Roderick Subramanian Trebi. It was a complete offshoot of the paper that actually inspired and changed my view of the world, which is the Acemoglu-Johnson-Robin paper and the settled mortality paper. So I think next time, I think maybe we should put up Simon's picture rather than mine, because it was really a very inspirational paper for me, and the origin of, the whole institutions are important school. So coming back to convergence, the good news, I think that this is finally happening. The reason we wrote this piece was because there's a review out in a very prestigious journal, and in a sense, we were a bit frustrated by the fact that the review perpetuates the kind of pessimism that, there's been no convergence. You can see very clearly there is, beginning about 1990 or so, and strengthening after 2000. The pace of convergence is still weak, but I think it's picking up. And I think it's important to note that, it's a little bit like, Goodhart's law, that once you start focusing on a variable, it changes. Ed Glaser said that once Barrow and Sly Martin documented convergence amongst the regions of the United States, that process stopped. I think once, similarly, Barrow, Mankiw, Romer, Weil, and Land Pritchett said divergence big time. As soon as they pronounced that, I think convergence started happening. So it's an interesting thing, but I think this is unambiguously good news. It's actually quite broad, this convergence. That's why we call this convergence with a vengeance. And just another point, I think we must stop talking about the middle income trap, because in a sense, if you look at these graphs, there's actually a hump. This is growth, this is initial income. You find, especially as you go out in the last 15, 20 years, that hump in the middle, and with due respect to Homi, who's sitting here, there is no middle income trap. If anything, this convergence thing, the beta coefficient is weak, because actually the middle income countries are growing faster than the low income countries. So I think we should stop talking about middle income traps, and I think just celebrate the fact that we have convergence, the good news going forward. Now, looking ahead, why should one be positive about the future? I think that favorable demography is still in play for the late convergers. So by late convergers, I mean that category. If you leave aside the Chinas and the East Asians and start the clock, say, after 1980, 85, all those that are currently kind of low or middle income countries, those are, in a sense, I think conceptually it's an important category because they are entering the convergence race at a point in time when the external environment, to say the least, is very different from what the external environment that faced the early convergers. So I think that's the analytical distinction for me, which makes me want to think afresh about why the old patterns may or may not be repeated going forward. Favorable demography, I think demography is potential. It's not destiny, but potentially you look at first the East Asians, then India. The factoid is still there that India's rapid growth, China's rapid growth, Korea's rapid growth did coincide with this demographic dividend. And Africa is, of course, waiting to catch up on that. So I think that factoid, that feature of demography is going to play a positive role in sustaining convergence going forward. But I think when we talk about technology in the future, I think there are two dimensions to technology. The scary one, I'm going to come at the end, what Simon and others call artificial intelligence and the labor-saving stuff. But there is a dimension of technology that I think is actually very, very bright. You see it, Anu referred to it in some of the, something that you mentioned as well. I think, and my friend Devesh Kapoor actually puts it as, a number of connectivity revolutions that are ongoing in all over the world, but also the late convergers as well. I think the physical connectivity revolution in India, for example, in the last 15, 20 years, physical infrastructure has really, come up in a big way. I think to the extent that, all of us can be not too alarmist about BRI and the Belt and Road Initiative, I think the upside would be the creation of physical infrastructure and, connectivity more broadly, which I think could have a massive impact on growth going forward. The other part of the revolution, of course, is the digital and the related financial and psychic revolutions of connectivity. Digital, we know, in India, for example, this is a huge part of what's going on. I coined a term called JAM, Jandhan Aadhaar Mobile. That is the bringing together of the financial inclusion, the biometric identity, and the mobile revolution. They all come together, and kind of pretty radical things can happen. Direct benefit transfers can be implemented, for example. As Anu was saying, the stack of private sector services that can be provided on top of this this platform of financial inclusion, biometrics, and mobile, I think the possibilities are immense. And a friend of ours, Nandan Nilekani, who actually implemented the biometric identity program. So if you think about it, in India, for example, now there are about over 1 billion people with the biometric identity. And I think the aim is that soon 1 billion biometrics, 1 billion bank accounts, 1 billion mobile connections, they all come together, of course, subject to privacy laws, security, all of that is kind of work in progress. But if they come together, the possibilities, and we see some of this happening not just in India, but also in Africa, for example, with the M-Pesa revolution, and in parts of East Asia as well. So I think this, and then the psychic component of that, I think is just enormous, because once you know what's going on elsewhere, I mean, all that it does to, not just creating expectations, but actually, knowing what can be done, asserting your rights. I think the whole psychic component of this connectivity thing is actually quite immense. This is my solo concession to Solo's, amateur sociologizing. I think we haven't done enough on this, the psychic part of it. I think, I don't know whether I'm now wading into hot water with my daughter here, but I think, for example, just today in India, a cabinet minister had to resign because of, allegations of sexual harassment. I think that, that to me, the fact that it's a global thing, the psychic connections, I think are terribly important. If it's happening only in one country or one place. So I think this is, knowing what's happening elsewhere and acquiring rights, information as a result of that, I think is just quite huge. And I think this should not be overlooked. So this is reasons to be optimistic. And I would say that in India, many of these things are happening. So, I would be somewhat optimistic about India. But then there's a part of me which then says, wait a minute, let's get a reality check. And then this is where, and what I'm going to say, actually, we wrote up in the last economic survey with the help of Justin from CGD, with whom we wrote this, the latest blog on convergence. And I think there are, I would say, 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, the headwinds that are going to act against convergence. First, and at the Peterson Institute, I don't have to tell you this, the backlash against globalization. Now, I want to take you back to this chart, and I don't think it's a coincidence that the fact that the world started converging around this coincides with the phase of what I call hyper-globalization. World trade to GDP shot up, started accelerating. There was a post-war uptick because of the container, as he said, the GATT and WTO tariffs coming down, policy reform. But then since about 1990, you see in the chart world trade to GDP just accelerating the phase of hyperglobalization. So if that is the case, then any backlash against globalization is by definition going to. Now, you can tell this globalization story many ways. There's the story that Richard Baldwin says, which is very interesting, that basically what we've had, the way globalization has worked, is three big regional value-added chains. The China regional value-added chain, the Germany-centered Eastern Europe value-added chain, and the US-centered North America value-added chain. So all those countries that became part of these value-added chains experienced this tremendous growth. And so, if there's a backlash against this, I think we're going to be in for trouble. Now, I think there's a kind of one country collective problem as well. When I think about India, or when I think about, say, a small country, the way I think about this backlash against globalization is, what is the carrying capacity of the world to maintain overall trade to GDP ratios? Is the potential here? Clearly not, it seems. Is it flat, in which case I think many countries can still prosper? But if it were to come down like this because of the political appetite for trade, then I think many of the late convergers are going to be in serious trouble. And I think that I worry about that a lot. Now, the next two set of, I think, headwinds against convergence, I think we need to think about them in terms of Arthur Lewis and the structural transformation. I think, there are implicit in the famous Lewis model are actually two structural transformations, or two things happening. One is the pull factor, which is resources are moving towards dynamic and high productivity sectors. So that's one component of the Lewis transformation. I'm going to talk about that. But I think, having been in India these last 4 years, I have come to realize that all of us have ignored, not maybe CGD and Bill Gates and others, but all of us have ignored that successful Lewisian transformation also requires resources going out of agriculture under conditions of rapid agricultural productivity growth. If you have languishing agricultural productivity growth, then the Lewisian transformation looks very different. And in a sense, this relates to the comment that Nancy made about how land reforms in East Asia and so on sustained high levels and rising rates of agricultural productivity growth. So let me talk about these two. I think, Danny's point, of course, is that, this is premature deindustrialization. This is the income at which manufacturing employment peaks. This is the peak share. And what you find is that the poorer you are, you're peaking earlier and at lower levels of manufacturing. I actually think that, while it's right, I think the story should be broadened more, because it's not just manufacturing, but potentially there are other high productivity sectors. And in the economic survey, we kind of said, let's say IT, finance, there are a bunch of other sectors like manufacturing, which have this kind of convergence property. Once you get on them, it becomes a ladder and you move up. And what you find is that indeed, you find that these kind of good growth, as it were, good structural transformation is becoming, kind of more and more infrequent amongst, even in India, for example. So you can actually do simple growth analysis, decompositions, and find out how much of growth is good growth, in the sense that resources have moved from low productivity to high and productivity activities. And you find that apart from the East Asians, what this chart, if you can decipher it, essentially is saying is that all these points are moving to the left. Dots are just the share of good growth, and they're all kind of moving to the left over time. So you are seeing less structural transformation in the broader sense that, to generalize Danny's premature industrialization point. And again, this is a comment that someone made. My worry is that transformation is going to become one not from informal agriculture to formal manufacturing, but basically from informal agriculture, quasi-agricultural activities to only slightly less informal services and other kinds of activities. From informality to informality is, I think, what I really worry about when we think about, the structural transformation and the whole premature deindustrialization phenomenon. So I think that, Anu, coming back to your report, I would have loved to see in your firms what is their share of employment and how has that increased over time, because then you get a sense of these big firms, they're dynamic, but they're also employing more people, and that's how economic growth and development take place. How much of that is happening would be very useful to see. China, as Nick has documented, has done a terrific job of transferring resources from agriculture to manufacturing, as did many Korea and so on. But a country like India, for example, has not done that. Our share of manufacturing peaked at 17%. Formal employment in manufacturing is probably about 7-8%. So it's still got a long way to go. And by definition, high productivity services don't employ very many people. They're very skill intensive and demanding. So that transformation where a huge bulk of labor resources can benefit from high productivity activities is, I think, a major challenge going forward. Then I think this is the overlooked push dimension of Louisian transformation. A fact that I did not know, and this is basically the convergence. This is just labor productivity in agriculture. All you need to know is that it's upward sloping, so there's divergence big time in agricultural productivity. Poor countries' agricultural productivity growth is way below rich countries, and therefore you are getting transformation not from against the background of rising agricultural productivity. Remember, in Lewis, you needed higher agricultural productivity because you needed the food for people to eat as they moved out of agriculture. I think today for the late convergers, that's not the problem, I think. And again, this is a hypothesis. I think the problem more is that when you get rising productivity and incomes in agriculture, you also get the human capital formation that is necessary for the transformation into whatever they're moving into. And I think that is not happening. So now you have divergence in relatively low agricultural productivity in poorer countries. You have divergence big time. And then on top of that, you have all these Malthusian specters hanging over agriculture. Climate change, inadequate water, inadequate land. So, again, in the survey, we did some very detailed analysis. We find that, temperature increases, for example, the predicted temperature increases from climate models could reduce agricultural yields and incomes by about 20 to 30% in the long run. I mean, you're talking about huge impacts on agriculture. So I think that this is a dimension that, and I plead guilty to because, all my work has always been on manufacturing and services and trade. But, when you go there and you see how agriculture is doing and how important it is, I think we've kind of neglected this and therefore, and I don't know what's going to change here. I mean, whether we're going to have technologies that are going to overcome these problems, I don't know. But I think this is a really important aspect about structural transformation that needs more attention. My last slide and point relates to technology and robotics and artificial intelligence. Now, there's a part of me that's the comparative advantage, who understands comparative advantage, who says, take a list of activities from A to Z, varying degrees of skill intensity. So this is the most labor intensive, this is the least labor intensive. A comparative advantage says developing countries will do this, use that as the ladder and move forward. But in a sense, if you think about what technology is doing, I think it's basically making more and more activities, skill labor intensive and not unskilled, and away from being unskilled. Like, for example, clothing. If robots can cut cloth, soft cloth, then we're in for a real problem because, all the Bangladeshis, Vietnams, and Indias, and Ethiopias that want to use clothing and textiles to move up, they're in trouble. Now, but so that's the kind of technology. But the trade theorist in me, or not, the poor trade theorist in me says, comparative advantage is relative. No matter what the technology, there should still be a bunch of activities that low-skill intensive countries should do. But these two intuitions kind of collide with each other, and my pessimism tends to say that, it is a problem. There are going to be more and more activities that no longer need unskilled labor. Therefore, I think what happens is that I think human capital becomes very important, human capital formation, not to do the high-tech innovation or whatever, but to be able to use and adapt the new technology. And this is where I think the news is very, very grim from the developing world. Now, I thought Nancy would speak to this. Essentially, and I'm going to explain this chart in a second, essentially we know there's been huge convergence in health outcomes like life expectancy. We know there's been huge convergence in enrollment, primary, secondary enrollment, etc. But we know from all the work that's coming around that learning outcomes around the world are either stagnant or declining. Now, this is a chart from India, which based on data that this very fantastic NGO Pratham collects. What this shows is these are, just focus on one of them. Say you have a math chart. What this says is, this is a kind of poverty count. Says only 40% of kids in third grade meet a certain absolute standard of, being able to do a few simple things. What you find, of course, is that, so this is the poverty gap, as it were, in learning. Obviously, as you grow up, you go across grades, the poverty gap declines. But that's only because the standard is an absolute poverty standard. That is, in 8th grade, can you do something that a 3rd grader would do? So this declines. Now, if you were to do something like a grade-appropriate learning poverty count, the poverty gaps are high and are growing over time. Now, this is the scary thing, is the red dotted line, that essentially technology is going to make what human capital is required. It's going to make those demands greater. Your proficiency has to be much greater for every grade level. So these are going to be the poverty gaps, learning poverty gaps around the world, in developing countries and emerging market countries, this is what we're going to see. So in that scenario where, you have artificial intelligence, robotics, and you want, more and more of the workforce to be able to at least be conversant, to be part of the labor force that uses this technology, then I think something has to be done to improve learning outcomes. And unless that happens, I will always, I think, kind of err on the side of being more cautious than optimistic. Now, notice that I haven't even got into the things that Nancy spoke about, inequality. And one aspect of the discussion that we've completely, deliberately not got into is, there are a bunch of countries which once upon a time the World Bank used to refer to them as like us. They were never, what distinguished them, they were never like us. They were low-income countries under stress. These are, the high, what are called the high fragile countries. That list is either stagnant or growing. So even leaving aside that part of the world, the fragile countries, I think that, so to cut a long story short, I want to be optimistic as Anu has been in the report. My experience in India, I think kind of broadly reinforces that optimism, but I think we have to be really mindful of these real headwinds that I think confront the late convergers in a way that did not the early convergers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Arvind. So many ideas in such a short, compact package. Oh. Hello?
Yeah, now you are. Yeah, I think you're.
Okay. First, I just want to cheer you for picking up where you left off on killing the middle income growth trap. Some of you will recall that Arvind and separately Nick Lardy and Marcus Noland a few years ago all gave different ways of getting to skepticism about that, and these latest hump charts are very interesting. Secondly, thank you for attacking the cult of small and medium businesses. Obviously, there's a great deal of literature now on the superstars, and what matters is the removal, as you say, the exit. We mentioned Caroline's work, we mentioned others' work. McKinsey, of course, has done a lot of work on this as well. I remember we had an event here a couple of years ago on Mexico, and Jana Rames spoke about the backward sector in Mexico being predominantly these little small businesses. So, but let me turn to some of, I guess, your newer stuff. First, on the optimistic side, when you talk about the, you talked about the trade. You talked very little about financial factors. Is this a good news message that as long as you just don't blow up your financial system, you don't need to worry about it? Is this a message that hyper-globalization is all about the real side, not about banking and finance, or did I miss something?
Yeah, the thing is, as you know, Simon, I think, sorry, Adam, I think, sorry.
You're coming through loud and clear.
Okay. As you know, Adam, I've never been a big fan of especially international finance. So I think you put it well. I think that there are two dimensions to finance I think one should think about in this late converger context. One is they should not be a source of instability. So you need that basic, whatever regulation, whatever. But in the context of international flows, I would be much more in favor of cautious opening over opening of that. But I think the part of finance that I think that is important is the whole financial inclusion side. People at the bottom of the pyramid getting credit, getting access to savings instruments and so on. And there I think that the technology revolution, the biometric revolution, enable that in a way that I think is very promising for long run. So that's the way I kind of think about finance. Don't blow it up, but at the lower end, I think financial inclusion I think is terribly important.
Great. Another one of your, we'll call them optimistic factors, pushing for convergence, was talking about, I thought, very nicely, the psychic idea that people become aware of what's out there in the world and what's possible. And many of us in Washington were bred on the image of economists market people won the Cold War because Boris Yeltsin got to see what an American supermarket was like. But
I think there's a lot to that. I do think there's a lot to that.
I'm not being dismissive, but let me ask you to expand a little bit. We're in a period where clearly large parts of the at least political elites in the West are turning against liberal regimes, liberal market economies, the ability of the U.S. to stand up and yammer about Washington consensus was bad enough post-financial crisis, and now even more so. So when people in India, in Malaysia, pick whatever late converger you want to talk about, look around the world psychically, does this matter? Do they need to have something Beijing, Washington, Turin consensus, or can they just make their own way?
No, I think that actually is, again, a great question. And for example, in the last 6 months in India, as you know, trade restrictions have been imposed. A lot of trade, and it's been a reversal of about 20, 25 years of policy. Now, there's a whole domestic political economy to it, but there is no doubt in my mind that the legitimization of that also happens by invoking what's happening around the world. So that's also a kind of intellectual psychic connection that's made. So the psychic connections can be good, can be bad. So for example, I think the US blew up its financial system, and people say, well, we have to do finance a bit differently from the way they did. So that's a good message to take away. But currently, I think the whole backlash against globalization, and that would be true, even for example against immigration, and people can take away. So I think all these connections cut both ways. And at the moment, I think that the globalization thing is creating negative psychic connections around the world.
Great. Let me ask two short questions on your more pessimistic horseman slides, as it were, before turning to our audience. In terms of the pessimistic side, picking up on what you just said, you know, we're obviously at Peterson Institute, in part thanks to you, very fertile ground for hearing you say, wow, the period of beta unconditional convergence really picked up during the period of what you called hyperglobalization. How much should we think about the composition of trade flows mattering versus the just sheer volume? So our colleague Sherman Robinson, among others, we've all been thinking about, well, even if the US decides to pull itself out in all these self-destructive ways, you know, there is what used to be called South-South trade. There is a world out there. Can that be an engine? Can opening outside the US-centric or outside the Europe-US hubs make a difference?
In fact, I think, Adam, thanks for asking that question, because I think that when I showed, you know, the trade to GDP ratios around the world going down, and then we don't know what the prospect for this is, I think as a late converger, I would like markets to be as open as they were for the early convergers, right? So the early convergers benefited from Western markets being open. I think now it's incumbent on the early convergers, especially China, right, to open up its markets in a way that, you know, late convergence can benefit from. So essentially the composition thing, the geographic composition, as it were, of trade, I think is terribly important, especially if you think that the overall global political carrying capacity is going to be limited. Then I think some space for that has to be created by some of the more dynamic emerging market countries who've done to themselves become more open than they frankly currently are today. Right. And that would include India as well. You know, India has to be more open. So, so there is a sense in which, you know, once upon a time I was a beneficiary, but now, you know, I also am a kind of market for others, which I think, and I think that, so the way I think a little bit about China, what's happening vis-a-vis China, I think there is, you know, the whole backlash against China. The truth is that it commands more consensus across the spectrum here than some of the other things that are being discussed, right? I think in the late converger world too, that resonates for this reason that I'm saying that, you know, we too want to be able to, you know, export into what are very dynamic markets, including China. So that part is not just shared across the political spectrum in the US. I think it has broader support also in the late converger world that, you know, some of these countries should open up as well.
Great. Final question. I found, again, this isn't my literature, I learned from you and the people in this room, but I found very fresh the remarks you were making about your retake on the great transformation from Lewis, that in particular the idea of moving into informal services as opposed to informal agriculture. But I must admit, I wasn't entirely clear whether you were saying that's just the reality, whether you were saying that is an embodiment of what you were saying with premature industrialization is a problem. Could you just clarify a bit more about what you meant?
Yeah. So what I meant was that essentially Danny is saying that around the world, fewer and fewer people, fewer and fewer resources are being employed in high productivity manufacturing. Right. All I want to say is that one shouldn't keep that focus just on manufacturing. The potential for dynamism also comes from other sectors being like manufacturing. However, even if you include that broader set of dynamic countries, there just isn't enough resource flowing into that. Therefore, as a fact, not as and which we need to examine, as a fact, we are perhaps seeing this, what I call impeded structural transformation from informality to just lesser informality, not from informality to pure formality, either in manufacturing or in these other services.
Thank you. That's very clear. Let me now open it up for questions. Again, the ground rules is all on the record. The ground rules are, please identify yourself when asking a question. Please make it more brief than the question we got in the first session. And if go to either to the standing microphone in the back or raise your hand to be recognized at the front. Who would like to go first, please?
Sunil Sharma from George Washington University. So Arvind, this is, I think, relevant to many of the countries, but I'll ask it in the context of India.
So, yeah.
I'll ask it in the context of India.
Yeah.
So it's sort of related to what Simon and you just exposited. So it's more to do with, say, human capital development, the legal system, and state capacity. And here's the story I have in mind. Right? Recently, the World University Rankings came out. Okay? US has 60, China has 7, India has 0. Okay? So in terms of human capital development, India is obviously lagging quite a bit. India's legal system, again, needs a fair amount of reform to be a system which will be able to adjudicate contracts quickly and efficiently. With the digital revolution just in some sense getting going, we need state capacity in a sense to organize, oversee this transformation.
Question.
So the question is, do you think that currently we're on a trajectory where there is the human capacity development, the legal system, and the state capacity that will be able to generate the employment, the growth, and maintain a trajectory of 8 to 10%?
See, again, can I respond?
Of course.
Yeah. So I did not want to get into, the whole question of, at some level when you say, some countries are doing well and others not, ask deeper questions. Institutions are one of them. But I think that one should think about institutions in a more differentiated way. Now, I thought Cullen actually had a very brilliant insight. I don't know whether it's true or not. Empirically, we have to see. No, I think.
But it was brilliant.
No, I'll tell you what's brilliant. I'm telling you what's brilliant about this. That, former Soviet, if you had an apparatus for economic thing, then the capacity part of it is looked after. Then you have to change the incentives and all the kleptomania and all of that goes around. But at least you have the capacity to do these things. And that's, I think Cullen's very good insight. Now, so when Simon and others wrote originally about institutions, they focused a lot more on this protection of property rights, rule of law. But I think there is a huge complementary agenda just in building state capacity, which I think you said. I think it's complementary. I think that state capacity is very much a product of historical forces. I think history plays a huge impact on state capacity. I think that if you also go back, I think Charles Tilley's insight was amazing. I think wars make states and states make wars. I think that was a big part of it. I actually think for whatever it's worth, my one-line insight on India is that the whole Gandhi freedom movement struggle, a lot of the mobilization happened around building state capacity for political development. Very little mobilization happened for building state capacity around delivery of economic outcomes, and that's why our state capacity remains weak. By the way, I intend to develop this into a book, but I think this is Indian state capacity is not there as yet. And if that's, but the interesting thing about India is that we've done this massive project, the Jan Dhan Aadhaar mobile platform. We've done the GST, which is an enormous feat of administrative capacity. So in India, state capacity varies from spectacular to the human development thing, where it's still a bit lagging. So, but building state capacity, I think, is going to be very difficult.
Very good. So, Nancy and then John.
So 2 quick questions.
Nancy Birdsall from the Center for Global Development.
Thank you, Adam. Would you talk about Africa? Some of what you said made me think maybe we have to revisit the idea of a poverty trap. On the demography side, it's not a dividend. you know, even in Latin America, they didn't fully exploit the dividend because of poor policy setting. In Africa, it's just a huge challenge. So the Lewis transformation,
Both sides.
agricultural productivity is so low that, as I said, labor costs in urban areas are high because the price of food is high. Physical connectivity is not there, just simple stuff, roads and so on. And the human capital learning, I mean, you have things like 80% of sixth graders can't read a sentence. So talk about that a little bit. Maybe you want to compare it, I don't know, to Bihar or something like that. I don't know. Second question, The Economist recently had its big thing about liberalism, you know, return of liberalism, or we need more back to classic Anglo-Saxon liberalism. And one of the things they mentioned is land taxes that no one has ever succeeded in doing. And you've talked about that.
Yeah.
And the connection to corruption and rent seeking that could be cut if there were taxes on land, not just taxes on property, but land itself. So if you have anything to say about that and why you couldn't do it in India, or did you try?
See, Nancy, on the first question, you know, I think whether are these poverty traps or state capacity traps or governance traps, I think these are terribly important questions. But I think, remember, and that's where I wanted to end, I ended, that on top of that, you have all these other pathologies, right? Resource curves, foreign aid, the whole conflict, all of that. So in some sense, if I'm, you know, cautiously, whatever, mildly pessimistic about some of the late convergers, I think one has to be quite pessimistic about, you know, some of these other, the late convergers, as it were. And frankly, I don't know what the answer to that is, but I do think there are state capacity. See, I'll tell you what the difference I feel with India is, and your Bihar example brought that to mind. See, I think in India, what I think we, on the upside, which is very a positive, is that we have, you know, 29 democracies, full-fledged democracies, but a place where, you know, completely integrated. So you can have competitive federalism. You can have, you know, some states doing well, others learn from that, or you just people leave, exit. There's, you know, exit, trade, all those channels for change are there in India in a way that I don't know whether you have it to the same extent in sub-Saharan Africa. So in that sense, I am more upbeat about India, even on these state capacity. On land and property, I cannot tell you how important these are. You know, they're important in advanced countries, I think in Britain and others, you know, with especially with capital so mobile, you know, you get corporate taxes, you know, are coming down. You have to, you know, tax, you know, more immovable stuff. Actually, Daron and Simon wrote a piece in Foreign Policy, which I thought was terrific in the sense that, look, you can't tax capital as much anymore. Increasingly, you're taxing labor. That's what's happening, and that's contributing to this, at least post-market income inequality. So it has to be the case that, you know, not just in late convergence, but in advanced countries as well, land and property, you know, property values are going through the roof, and you can't, you know, fiscalize any of that. So in countries like ours, I think it's equally important, but for other reasons. But here's why the fact that it hasn't happened so far, why? I think the strong political economy constraints around that. And again, all the historians can correct me about US history. I find it fascinating that in the United States, during the infrastructure boom, essentially much of that was financed at the third tier via land and property taxes, because franchise, I mean, that's too strong, at a time when franchise was limited. So essentially, you know, you could tax land and build infrastructure because infrastructure increased the property values of the people who had the political franchise. So that, you know, limited franchise and property tax and political and economic equilibrium.
And you could argue something similar with the two reform bills in mid 19th century UK as well.
Correct, exactly. So and I don't know. That's why I think that, to me, that's a very important lesson. But I find, I'm not sure how, there's just a small factoid. We did some work in the economic survey based on satellite data. I mean, we're probably collecting 5% of what we should be collecting in property taxes. And my sense is that the closer you are to the people, so in India you can tax at 3 different levels, the more difficult it is it's going to be able to tax them. So some kind of federal tax on land for me in India is probably the way forward.
Let me collect 2 sets of questions. So John Lipsky first, and then who wants to be next? Then Ted can go to the microphone. So John.
Okay, thanks, simple. See if I understood, excuse me. Excuse me. Help. There we go. Did I?
Ted, go first. While Jen,
Okay.
John.
So my question is, Ted Truman from the Peterson Institute. My question is sort of goes to the macro. Mm-hmm. So one interpretation about what's gone on over the last, or a possible interpretation of what's going on over the last 25 years is that after the sort of doldrums of the 1980s and the first part of the 90s, right, where we had, you had a period in which actually government policies around the world got substantially improved, right, and that had feedback effects and in terms of countries being able to catch up. Now, some people worry that in the last, and that allowed, in terms of the global financial crisis, more pro-cyclical, counter-cyclical policies to be put in place, but it also led more recently to build up in both public and private borrowing abroad, right? And so you're already asking for so some of these successes may end up in, having, now the question would be, are they going to have if you take the premise, is it going to be a hiccup or will it be a setback? And maybe you haven't thought about this sort of macroeconomic, global finance, which you already declared yourself on aspect, but I'd be interested in how you're thinking about the warnings, for example, that have been coming out of the International Monetary Fund recently about build-up of debt in about emerging market countries.
Yeah. Sorry, John, you want to ask the question, or should
I answer?
No, because unfortunately we're getting near time. So John, please.
I was going to say, Arvind, your arguments left me speechless, but it turned out to be just water. Did I understand your pessimism on technology and human capital regression? Underneath it is an idea of skill bias technological change, which has always been a puzzle to me. Because I think of my own life, and I think when I was an undergraduate, I had to learn Fortran to get a computer to add up, do arithmetic. And today I operate a supercomputer without having the slightest idea how it operates. I always thought technology made weak people strong and stupid people smart. Why do you think the opposite is the case?
I think if you can't recognize the characters on the keyboard, John, that's
pretty basic.
Yeah, that's why in response to I think the higher education thing in India, it's true, but I worry much more. I mean, the statistics show that, at 8th grade, I mean, 30%, 40% can't do 2nd and 3rd grade, and it's not a demanding standard. It's like, one sentence, as Nancy said, or a simple arithmetic, addition, subtraction, not even multiplication and division. So that's the sense in which I worry that, if you have some basic thing, maybe, I'm sure both are at work, but I worry that, it's just completely. On Ted's question, Ted, I think first, very good point. I think part of the psychic connection that I have in mind is the whole notion that macro stability is important for long-run growth. I think that's a lesson I think everyone, early convergers, late convergers, learned around the world the hard way, as you said, and so that's true. Now, in terms of I do think that there is something is changing now that we can no longer take macro stability for granted. I think one is of course the buildup of debt, in different parts of the world, CGD has documented, for example, in so many sub-Saharan African countries, rapid build-up in debt. And I do worry about that component of the Belt and Road Initiative, by the way. The flip side of the infrastructure is kind of the debt build-up. The other thing that I worry about, and this is happening in India, is the strength or the fragility or the vulnerability or the strength of the financial system. I think that there has been, now in India, for example, as we speak, we've had this, long-standing banking problem, which is kind of slowly getting resolved. But suddenly we find in India that the shadow banking system, in India, it's what they call non-bank financial companies, and the email, remember that question that you asked, the shadow banking system. So the whole, do we know, is it well-regulated, well-supervised? So those sets of problems in the context of rising both public and private debt, especially if kind of the environment for growth slows down. We know that combination is going to be, the number yesterday we saw from, and Nick is not here, the third-tier local government debt in China, $6 trillion, and that's the known part. We don't know what the unknown part. So I do think the broader point about both macro and financial stability, which we used to take for granted, I think we have to no longer take for granted.
Great. We're going to have to close it there. This has been an incredibly rich and, dare I say at times, profound discussion. Thanks, of course, to Anu Madgavkar and the team from McKinsey Global Institute for giving us the basis in their exciting new report on Outperformers. Thanks to Nancy Birdsall, Cullen, Hendrix, and Simon Johnson for providing so much meat for the discussion and broadening it. But thanks, of course, to the unique and wonderful Arvind Subramanian, who I only exaggerated twofold his accomplishments. This meeting is adjourned.